Hello everyone, this video is on non-chord tones. Now as the name suggests, non-chord tones are tones or notes that are not a part of the chord or the harmony that is in place at that time. So non-chord tones weren't necessarily created as much as they were discovered to be an entity that existed in music. When composers write, they normally don't come up with just a series of chord tones, or they don't harmonize every single note, because that would create all kinds of weird harmonic problems and it would just not sound correct to our way of hearing. So non-chord tones was the name given to every kind of pitch that didn't aid the harmonic progression of a piece. So in general, we've categorized non-chord tones into three different categories. The first of which is unaccented, or chord tones that don't happen on a strong part of the beat. The second are accented chord tones, or chord tones that happen on an accented part of the beat. And the third is chord tones that require more than three notes to classify. So our first non-chord tone is unaccented. It's the anticipation. So anticipations are aptly named, as it is essentially a note that is anticipating the next chord tone. So in the soprano line here we have a B and then a C. Now the non-chord tone, which is always marked in red for these examples, is a C. It comes before the actual chord tone is supposed to come, supposed to being in quotes. So what ends up happening is the non-chord tone precedes the actual arrival of the chord tone. It anticipates the next chord tone. So why don't we hear what that sounds like? These are very common at cadences, especially, if there's a trill on the last note. It's a common non-chord tone. The next non-chord tone we have is an escape tone, another accented non-chord tone. We're doing only accented non-chord tones right now. An escape tone is classified by being approached by step and being left by skip. So the first note here in the soprano is a C, and then the next is a D, that's the step. The non-chord tone is the D, and then from the D we leave by skip to the next chord tone. Now it's called an escape tone because originally the non-chord tone is moving in the direction, it's moving away from the next chord tone. Excuse me. So it almost seems like the line is going to suddenly break apart from the path it should, but instead it skips down to the chord tone where it was supposed to go and gets harnessed in. Why don't we hear what that sounds like? It almost leaves and then it comes right back. Now we have unaccented neighbor tones. Now there are two kinds of neighbor tones. There are upper neighbors and lower neighbors. Luckily, which is somewhat self-explanatory. A neighbor tone, like the rest of non-chord tones, are also very aptly named. A neighbor tone is approached by step and left by step, and both of these steps are in opposite directions. So in an upper neighbor, it is approached by a step up and left by a step down. In a lower neighbor, it is approached by a step down and left by a step up. So you go from one note, up one note or down one note, and then back to the note from which you started. So why don't we hear what an upper neighbor sounds like? Now the lower neighbor. Cool. Now we have the unaccented passing tone. Now the passing tone also has a pretty good name because it acts as a way to get from one chord tone to another in a linear way, in a scalar way. So it acts as a passage in between two chord tones. In this case, we go from C, D to E. If the next chord were an A minor chord, we could go from C, B to A. Passing tones are always stepwise in the same direction. So you approach by a step in one direction, and then you leave by step in the same direction. That's what a passing tone is. So why don't we hear what that sounds like? Again, these are both unaccented. I make the distinction because they both have accented counterparts. So the idea is still the same, and a neighbor tone is still a neighbor tone, a passing tone is still a passing tone. Now just where they happen is different. So when it's accented, it happens on a strong beat or a chord change. So why don't we hear what an accented upper neighbor sounds like? Cool. Now let's hear what an accented lower neighbor sounds like. Puts a little bit more stress on the non-chord tone because, again, it's accented, so it's harder to miss. Now we have the accented passing tone. Let's hear what that sounds like. Again, it sounds similar to the unaccented, except it's harder to miss the fact that we have a passing tone there. Our next accented non-chord tone is the suspension. A suspension is a non-chord tone that is held over from a previous chord tone that then falls by step to the next chord tone. So a suspension is also aptly named because essentially the previous chord tone is held over and then falls, as if, if something were to be suspended in air and you were to let it go, it would also fall. So why don't we hear what this sounds like? Suspensions can really bring in a lot of tension and are quite nice compositional tool. Those are also a fairly popular non-chord tone. Now, another accented non-chord tone, which is very much like the suspension, is the retardation. Like a suspension, it's a previous chord tone being held over to the next chord, except now it resolves up by step. So why don't we hear what that sounds like? Again, these two things are very similar. The main difference, though, is that a suspension resolves down and a retardation resolves up. Alright, now our last accented non-chord tone is the Appoggiatura. Now what is characteristic of an Appoggiatura is a skip in one direction and then a step in the opposite direction. In this case we have a skip up and a step down. Now it doesn't matter which direction you originally use for the skip, as long as the direction of this step is in the opposite direction. So in this way it's kind of like the retrograde or reverse of an escape tone, if that helps you remember it. If not, don't worry about it. So let's see what that sounds like. Just to clarify a little bit, the reason I say it's kind of like the retrograde of an escape tone is because an escape tone goes by step and then skip, whereas this goes by skip and then step. But only if that works for you. Otherwise, don't worry about it. Now we move on to non-chord tones that involve more than 3 notes. Now, while there are only 2 non-chord tones in this example, it involves more than 3 notes because you involve the first chord tone, and then the next chord tone as well, so that's 4 notes in total. So this is called changing tones or a neighbor group. Now the reason it'd be called a neighbor group is because if you inserted a B in between these notes, which I'm going to do now actually, it would turn out that this note is essentially a lower neighbor and that this note is essentially an upper neighbor. So it's called the neighbor group because it is both types of neighbors, The main difference is that that middle B is just not there. So that's why it's called a neighbor group. So anyway, changing tones or neighbor group is characterized by a step in one direction, a skip in the opposite direction, and then a step back to the chord tone at which you were. So in this case, going from B, step down to an A, skip up to a C, and then back down to a B. Let's hear what that sounds like. Cool. So now we reach another non-chord tone that involves more than 3 notes, the pedal point. Now this comes from organs, essentially. Organs have 3 staves that they use, staves that they use. The first 2 are dedicated to manuals or keyboards. They're essentially like pianos stacked up on top of each other. And then below, organists can use their feet, and what they play is the pedal board. So something that would be very easy for organists to do, especially as organs were more mechanical and harder to operate, took more force to play them. Something that would be very convenient is to just put your foot down on one note and change the harmony up above with your hands. So that's why this non-chord tone was given the name pedal point. It's just the idea of holding one note constant as if you had your foot down on the pedal and were changing everything else. So why don't we hear what that sounds like. So just to be a bit more clear about it, a pedal point is characterized by a sustained note that doesn't change despite changing harmony in the other voices. Now it doesn't have to happen in the bass, but it happens in the bass most of the time in music. However, you can have it in any of the voices, I suppose. Okay, so that covers non-chord tones. If you have any questions, I highly suggest the Wikipedia page on non-chord tones. It's very good. Alright. Have a nice night. Good night.